With her own father, she had 5 deformed children, the darkest secret ever uncovered among the Amish in the USA. Within the verdant plains of Pennsylvania, between well-tended fields and the constant sound of carriage wheels on dirt roads, a disturbing reality lurked, one that remained hidden for decades. Our story opens in the summer of 1962, when a 16-year-old Amish girl named Sarah Stoltzfus vanished suddenly from her Lancaster County community. What no one suspected was that Sarah had not run away as initially believed. Her own father, Jacob Stoltz, had hidden her in an isolated cabin deep on the family property, far from the community's curious eyes. A 42-year-old widower, Jacob had lost his wife 3 years earlier during the birth of their 6th child. That loss had transformed the man. Once respected for his religious devotion and hard work at the local carpentry shop, he was part of an Amish community known for its deliberate isolation from the modern world, for wearing simple clothes and rejecting electricity and automobiles. They lived by centuries-old traditions, prioritizing family, manual labor, and faith. This isolation created a perfect environment for secrets to stay buried for generations. The first suspicions only arose in 1967, when a local midwife, Ruth Miller, was urgently called to the Stoltz property. There, she found Sarah, now 21, in advanced labor. What the midwife witnessed that night would haunt her for the rest of her life. The child brought into the world displayed alarming traits: a disproportionately small head, widely spaced eyes, and fused fingers. Something was wrong in that family, Ruth reported years later. Sarah seemed like a prisoner, not a mother. And Jacob was present not as a grandfather awaiting a birth, but as a man observing his property. The midwife noticed 2 other small children in the cabin, all with similar physical characteristics, a disturbing repetition of abnormal traits. The marks of consanguinity were evident: cognitive issues, facial malformations, motor difficulties, and, in some cases, severe heart problems. What Ruth didn't know was that this was already the 3rd child born from that forbidden union. The other 2, kept hidden from the community, presented even more severe conditions. In the Amish community, marriages between cousins were not uncommon due to population isolation, but a union between father and daughter represented an unforgivable transgression, even within that closed system. The local bishop, Eli Yoder, maintained strict control over marriages to avoid very close unions, but Sarah's situation never reached his knowledge. The cabin where she lived was almost 2 kilometers from the main Stoltz house, deeply hidden among dense trees. Jacob had built the place years before, supposedly as a storage shed. The simple structure held only 2 rooms, one for sleeping and another serving as kitchen and living room. The windows were small and covered with dark fabrics, making the interior gloomy even during the day. Jacob's other children, 2 boys and 2 girls, had been sent to live with relatives in Amish communities in Ohio and Indiana shortly after their mother's death. This strategic separation eliminated potential witnesses and questions about Sarah's whereabouts. When asked about his daughter's disappearance, Jacob would only say she had been sent to help a sick aunt in another community. The explanation, though vague, was accepted without much question, as was customary among the Amish, who valued family privacy above almost all else. After witnessing the conditions Sarah lived in, midwife Ruth faced a moral dilemma. Revealing what she had seen would mean breaking the trust placed in her. Remaining silent, however, would be consenting to that young mother's and her children's continued suffering. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel. These stories reveal humanity's darkest truths that no one else dares to tell, and you need to know them before time buries them again. The second chapter of this dark story unfolds in 1970, when Sarah Stoltzfus gave birth to her 4th child under even more precarious conditions. By then, her body showed visible wear from consecutive pregnancies and a life of confinement. At only 24, she looked twice her age, with prematurely grey hair and a permanently empty gaze. Ruth Miller, the midwife who had assisted the previous birth, decided to break her silence, but cautiously. Without directly confronting authorities or the Amish bishop, she began visiting the cabin periodically, bringing food, children's clothes, and basic medications. These discreet visits allowed her to document the situation gradually. Sarah's 4th child, a boy Jacob named Elam, was born with problems more serious than his siblings. His legs were bowed at impossible angles, and he had a severe facial deformity that made feeding difficult. His fingers were fused like small claws, and his breathing came with a constant wheeze, indicating pulmonary issues. The scientific community was well aware of consanguinity's effects. By the 1970s, studies had shown how reproduction between close relatives dramatically increases the chance of problematic recessive genes manifesting, resulting in various congenital conditions. For the Stoltz children, the deformity pattern followed exactly what was expected for parental incest. Each new child seemed to present more serious problems than the last, Ruth observed in notes found decades later. It was like watching a cruel demonstration of the genetic dangers we were taught in nursing school, but in real time, in innocent children. The three older children, Isaiah, 8, Rebecca, 6, and Daniel, 3, showed different degrees of impairment. Isaiah, the firstborn, had severe cognitive difficulties and at 8 could barely form complete sentences. Rebecca had an abnormal spinal curvature and vision problems that left her nearly blind. Daniel suffered frequent seizures that, without adequate treatment, progressively weakened his nervous system. Jacob kept his children completely isolated. They never attended the local Amish school, never participated in Sunday services or community meetings. For all intents and purposes, these children did not officially exist. There were no birth records, vaccination cards, or any documentation. Ruth discovered Jacob justified his behavior with a distorted interpretation of Scripture. In her notes, she mentions he frequently quoted biblical passages about maintaining lineage purity and obeying the father as one obeys God. This religious manipulation was particularly effective on Sarah, who had grown up learning never to question paternal authority. The cabin deteriorated over the years. The roof leaked during rains, and cold penetrated wall cracks during Pennsylvania's rigorous winters. The children all slept together on a single straw mattress on the worn wooden floor, while Sarah occupied a small bed in the opposite corner. Jacob rarely spent the night in the cabin, returning to the main house where he maintained the appearance of a devoted widower. The family's diet was precarious, mainly what Jacob brought during irregular visits: bread, potatoes, occasionally milk and eggs. The older children showed clear signs of malnutrition, thin limbs and distended bellies. Sarah tried to compensate by cultivating a small garden behind the cabin in warmer months, but her own debilitated health limited what she could produce. The winter of 1971 was particularly severe in Lancaster County. Blizzard after blizzard isolated the already remote Stoltz cabin even more. For almost 3 weeks, Jacob couldn't make the journey due to deep snow. When he finally arrived, he found little Elam dead, his fragile body unable to resist the extreme cold and lack of adequate food. Instead of reporting the death or seeking a proper burial, Jacob simply wrapped the child in a blanket and buried him under an old oak tree at the back of the property. There was no ceremony, no headstone, no official acknowledgement Elam had ever existed. Ruth, prevented from visiting by the same weather, was horrified to discover what had happened. This tragic event finally convinced her she needed to take more drastic measures. She began systematically documenting her observations, detailed notes on each child's physical condition, the cabin's living conditions, and the behavioral patterns of Jacob and Sarah. Meanwhile, far away, American society was undergoing significant transformations. The 1970s marked an era of greater awareness about domestic abuse and children's rights. Mandatory reporting laws for health professionals were beginning to be implemented in various states, but Amish communities frequently remained isolated pockets where authorities rarely interfered. The year 1973 marked a turning point. Sarah, now 27 and pregnant with her 5th child, began showing signs of resistance for the first time. Ruth Miller's notes document subtle changes, hesitant questions about the outside world, requests for books to teach the children to read, and questions about why her children were born different. "Today Sarah asked me if all children are born like hers," Ruth wrote. "When I explained no, that her children had special conditions, I saw something awaken in her eyes, a recognition, perhaps even an understanding." Sarah's growing awareness coincided with changes in family dynamics. Isaiah, now 11, began demonstrating aggressive behaviors toward his grandfather. Despite cognitive limitations, the boy seemed to instinctively position himself as protector of his mother and younger siblings during Jacob's visits. In a community where history and traditions were transmitted orally, Sarah had grown up with limited knowledge of human reproduction and heredity. Her formal education had ended at 14, as was customary, and topics related to intimacy were rarely discussed openly. This knowledge gap facilitated Jacob's manipulation over the years. Ruth, recognizing this vulnerability, began to educate Sarah discreetly, using simple language and analogies with animal breeding, something familiar in the Amish context. She gradually explained the dangers of consanguineous relationships. Just as one should not cross horses of the same blood because the foals are born weak, the same happens with people, Ruth carefully explained. When parents and children have children together, the little ones are born with problems. Sarah's fifth pregnancy proved more complicated than the others. At 7 months, she developed severe preeclampsia with extreme swelling, intense headaches, and blurred vision. Ruth, with her limited experience, recognized the gravity and insisted to Jacob that Sarah needed hospital care. If she doesn't receive adequate care, both she and the baby could die, the midwife warned. Not even you will be able to hide 2 deaths from the community. Reluctantly, Jacob allowed Ruth to transport Sarah to a small hospital in York, about 40 kilometers away. To protect his secret, he instructed Sarah to use his late wife's maiden name and say she was an Amish widow. Ruth, though complicit in this lie, saw in the hospitalization an opportunity to officially document Sarah's condition. At the hospital, doctors were alarmed by the young woman's physical state. Beyond preeclampsia, she showed signs of chronic malnutrition, multiple poorly healed fractures in her arms and legs, and severe anemia. The medical team also noticed scars from previous births, indicating she had given birth several times, contradicting the story of a young primiparous widow. Dr. Martin Reynolds, the obstetrician on the case, recorded his suspicions in a confidential report. The patient presents signs consistent with high-risk pregnancy aggravated by a possible situation of prolonged mistreatment. I recommend social evaluation and follow-up after discharge. In a moment alone with Sarah, while Ruth filled out forms at reception, Dr. Reynolds tried to obtain more information. Sarah, are you safe at home? Is there anyone who causes you fear or who might be harming you or your other children? At this crucial moment, something broke inside Sarah. Years of conditioning and fear had silenced her. But weeks of conversations with Ruth, and now this strange doctor's genuine concern, made her consider the possibility of a different life. I need you to share this story. If you're watching now, leave a comment saying, "These children deserved protection." We cannot allow stories like this to remain in the shadows. Your voice makes a difference. The birth was induced prematurely due to risks to Sarah's health. The girl who was born, whom Sarah silently named Hope, weighed only 1.8 kilograms and, like her siblings, showed visible congenital anomalies, a severe cleft palate, disproportionately short limbs, and serious respiratory problems. Dr. Reynolds, now certain he faced a case of consanguinity, ordered a series of basic genetic tests available at the time. Preliminary results confirmed his suspicions. The homozygosity pattern was consistent with what would be expected in a case of parental incest. Though detailed genetic analysis was still limited in the early 1970s, the observed markers were enough to alarm the medical team. During the 10-day hospitalization, Sarah began to build a relationship of trust with hospital social worker Martha Klein. While little hope fought for her life in the neonatal unit, Sarah, for the first time, felt heard and validated. In fragmented conversations, she began to reveal details of her life in captivity. The autumn of 1973 brought winds of change to the Stoltz case. While Sarah and newborn Hope remained under medical care, a silent investigation began to take shape. Martha Klein had contacted Lancaster County Sheriff William Decker, sharing the concerning information from Sarah. Decker, 58, with decades of experience dealing with local communities including the Amish, faced a delicate dilemma. The accusations were extremely serious, yet intervention in Amish matters was rarely well received and could complicate any investigation. "We need to proceed with extreme caution," Decker told Martha. "The Amish prefer to resolve problems internally. If we show up with patrol cars and uniforms, we risk finding nothing. Jacob will be alerted and may hide evidence or even flee with the children. The strategy was meticulous. Decker contacted Bishop Eli Yoder, not to reveal suspicions about Jacob, but to discuss general child welfare issues in the community. During the conversation, he casually mentioned the Stoltz name, carefully observing the religious leader's reaction. Jacob has been a reserved man since he lost his wife, commented the bishop. He remains faithful to our customs but rarely participates in community meetings. His older children went to live with relatives, and his daughter Sarah was sent to Ohio years ago, from what I remember. This confirmation that the bishop believed Jacob's fabricated story was crucial. It meant the Amish community was not aware of or involved in covering up the crimes, facilitating authorities' intervention without alienating the entire religious group. Ruth Miller, who had documented the case for years, finally handed over her diaries and notes to the authorities. The material included approximate birth dates, detailed descriptions of the children's physical conditions, and a carefully drawn map showing the hidden cabin's location on the Stoltz property. On October 17, 1973, a discreet team, Sheriff Decker, 2 plainclothes deputies, a county doctor, and Martha Klein, approached the Stoltz property. To avoid raising suspicions, they used a common vehicle instead of official cars, parking at a distance and completing the journey on foot. What they found confirmed their worst fears. Isaiah, Rebecca, and Daniel lived in deplorable conditions. The smell of urine and mold permeated the environment. The children wore torn, dirty clothes. There were no toys, books, or appropriate stimulation. The only furniture besides the beds was an unstable wooden table with 3 uneven benches. Dr. Howard Garrett, the accompanying physician, performed preliminary examinations. His notes describe the 3 minors show clear signs of prolonged medical neglect. The oldest, Isaiah, has a severe untreated dental infection. The girl, Rebecca, has a spinal curvature that, without intervention, will likely leave her completely incapacitated in a few years. The youngest, Daniel, presents open wounds on his legs, possibly due to vitamin deficiency. The operation was timed for when Jacob would be in town selling handcrafted furniture at the weekly market. When he returned late that afternoon, he was intercepted by Decker and his deputies at his property's entrance. Jacob's reaction when confronted was revealing. Instead of surprise or indignation, he simply lowered his head and said, "So they finally found out." During initial interrogation at the Lancaster police station, Jacob tried to justify his actions through a distortive mix of religious principles and personal needs. "After my wife died, I needed someone to take care of me in the house," he stated. Sarah was the oldest. It was her responsibility. The children happened. I didn't plan it. When asked why he kept everything secret, he replied, "I knew you wouldn't understand. Our ways are different from yours. We keep our families together. We take care of our own." This attempt to hide behind cultural practices was quickly rejected by both authorities and the Amish community itself. Bishop Eli Yoder, upon being informed, unequivocally declared, "This is not our way. Our faith would never allow such an abomination. Jacob disrespected not only your laws, but also ours and especially God's laws." News spread quickly, first among local authorities, then inevitably to the press. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette was the first to publish an article on October 25, 1973, with the carefully formulated headline, "Family Tragedy Discovered in Rural Pennsylvania Community." The article avoided directly mentioning the Amish, but the geographic location made it obvious to local readers. Public reaction was horror and indignation. Letters to the editor expressed everything from shock and compassion for the victims to criticism of authorities for not discovering the case earlier. Some more extreme voices even questioned the right of Amish communities to maintain isolation, arguing it facilitated abuse cover-ups. For Sarah, still recovering in the hospital with her newborn daughter, the event represented an emotional storm. For the first time in 11 years, she was free from her father's control, but faced a completely uncertain future, a 27-year-old Amish woman with no formal education beyond 8th grade, for children with special needs, and no skills for the modern world. Her prospects seemed bleak. Martha Klein, who had developed a strong bond with Sarah, took on guiding her through this transition. "What do you want for your future, Sarah?" she gently asked. "I want my children to stay with me," Sarah replied with surprising determination. "I want them to see the sun every day, learn to read, and never be afraid again." The trial of Jacob Stoltzfus in March 1974 set an important precedent in Pennsylvania's judicial system. It was one of the first cases of parental incest with such extensive evidence to go to trial in the state, and certainly the first involving an Amish community member. The cultural sensitivity required special precautions. Judge Henry Crawford ordered records partially sealed to protect the children's identities and restricted media coverage. Still, the Lancaster County courtroom was packed daily with people from neighboring counties witnessing what many called the trial of the century in the region. Sarah, still extremely fragile, testified behind a screen to avoid facing her father. Her almost inaudible voice described years of manipulation and abuse. She told how Jacob had gradually isolated her after her mother's death, first restricting contact with other community youth, then convincing her it was her responsibility to replace her mother in all aspects. He said it was God's will, Sarah testified. That in ancient times this was how families survived, that I was sinning if I disobeyed. The medical testimony was devastating to the defense. Dr. Reynolds and Dr. Garrett presented photographic evidence and detailed reports on the children's conditions. Dr. Benjamin Harris, a University of Pennsylvania geneticist called as an expert, explained in accessible terms how parental consanguinity dramatically increases risks of congenital defects. In a union between unrelated people, the chance of serious genetic problems is approximately 3 to 4%, Dr. Harris explained. In unions between first cousins, this risk rises to 5 to 7%. But in cases of parental incest like this one, the risk shoots up to 30 to 40%, with a tendency to increase with each consecutive generation. Jacob's defense, realizing the impossibility of denying the facts, centered on mental competence and religious influence. His lawyer, Theodore Weiss, argued that Amish cultural isolation and distorted scripture interpretation had created an alternative reality where Jacob did not fully understand the immorality and illegality of his actions. This strategy failed when former Amish community members testified that, far from being encouraged, incest was considered one of the most serious possible transgressions, explicitly mentioned in sermons as an abomination. After only 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous verdict, guilty on all charges, including inappropriate relationship with a minor, kidnapping, false imprisonment, and child neglect. Judge Crawford sentenced Jacob Stoltzfus to 40 years in prison without possibility of parole, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life incarcerated. Pronouncing the sentence, the judge made a statement cited in law books for decades: "This court recognizes and respects the religious and cultural diversity of our nation. However, some lines cannot be crossed in the name of any belief or tradition. The protection of children against abuse transcends all cultural differences and represents a universal value this court has a sacred duty to uphold." For Sarah and her children, the trial's end marked the beginning of an equally challenging journey. Little Hope, now 6 months old, remained in fragile health, requiring multiple surgeries for her cleft palate and congenital heart problems. Isaiah, Rebecca, and Daniel, after months in temporary homes during the trial, were finally reunited with their mother. Martha Klein helped Sarah establish herself in a small house on York's outskirts, far enough from Lancaster to avoid stigma, but close enough to maintain some connection with the Amish culture still part of her identity. An assistance fund was established through the local Mennonite church, allowing Sarah financial support while learning to navigate the modern world. At 28, she obtained her driver's license, something unthinkable in her previous life, and began classes to complete her high school diploma. The Stoltz children faced significant challenges. All four needed extensive therapies: physical, occupational, speech, and psychological. Isaiah, now 12, had the cognitive equivalent of a 5- or 6-year-old but demonstrated surprising aptitude for music. Rebecca, partially blind, developed remarkable talent for clay sculpture, using touch to compensate for limited vision. Daniel, though still suffering occasional seizures, responded well to newly developed anticonvulsants. In 1976, 3 years after liberation, Sarah was invited to share her story at a Temple University conference on child abuse in Philadelphia. With Martha's help, she prepared a brief speech. Her message was simple but powerful. I was taught the outside world was dangerous and that only within our community would we find protection. I learned questioning authority was sin. Now I know silence can also be sin. My children paid the price for what was not said, for what no one wanted to see. Today I speak for them and for all children still living in the shadows of silence. The Stoltz-Fuss case eventually led to significant changes in Pennsylvania laws on mandatory reporting of suspected child abuse. In 1977, the Stoltz Law, as it became known, expanded the list of professionals required to report signs of abuse to include midwives, clergy, and community school teachers, closing loopholes that had allowed the case to remain hidden so long. For the Amish community, the case represented a moment of self-reflection. While maintaining their desire for separation, many communities implemented more rigorous internal child welfare checks. Bishop Eli Yoder, deeply shaken by not perceiving what happened literally under his eyes, established regular home visits to all families with children in his congregation. The last Stoltz child, Hope, died in 1980 at 7 years old due to congenital heart complications. Despite the best medical efforts, her multiple conditions overwhelmed her small body. Sarah, devastated but resilient, transformed her grief into purpose. Using part of the money raised for Hope's medical expenses, she established a small foundation in her daughter's memory, dedicated to supporting children with disabilities in isolated rural communities. The case's impact extended far beyond Lancaster County. Case studies based on the family were included in medicine, social work, and law curricula at various American universities. The story highlighted not only the biological dangers of consanguinity, but also the social factors allowing such abuses to remain hidden. Rebecca, who developed remarkable artistic talent despite physical limitations, had her sculptures exhibited in a Philadelphia art gallery in 1985. Her works, characterized by complex textures and intricate organic forms, reflected a unique sensitivity shaped by perceiving the world primarily through touch. A Philadelphia Inquirer critic described her work as palpable in its emotional honesty, revealing a depth of experience that transcends the artist's youth. Isaiah found his voice through music. Though cognitive limitations remain significant, he demonstrated exceptional musical memory and the ability to reproduce complex melodies after hearing them just once. A local Mennonite church offered him a place in the choir, where his pure, unaffected tenor voice often brought congregants to tears. Daniel, the most reserved, found comfort in simple manual work. At 18, he began working part-time in a carpentry shop run by former Amish who maintained artisanal traditions. The irony of following his grandfather's professional footsteps did not go unnoticed. But Daniel transformed this dark legacy, specializing in creating wooden toys for children with special needs. Sarah Stoltz completed her GED in 1978 at 32. 2 years later, she enrolled in evening courses at York Community College, focusing on child development. Her personal experience combined with formal knowledge transformed her into a valuable counselor for other abuse survivors. In 1983, 10 years after the case's discovery, Washington Post journalist Ellen Burrows sought Sarah for a retrospective report. She found a transformed woman, confident, articulate, deeply committed to child protection. The resulting article, From Darkness to Advocacy, Sarah Stoltz's Journey, received a Pulitzer Prize nomination that year. I will never be completely free of the shadows of the past, Sarah confided to Burrows. But I've learned carrying these shadows doesn't mean being defined by them. Each time I help another family recognize signs of abuse, each time I see my children achieve something impossible years ago, I feel a little more weight being lifted. The case's legacy also manifested in medical procedure changes. In 1985, the University of Pennsylvania Hospital implemented a protocol designed to identify potential consanguinity cases based on documented observations from Sarah's and her children's doctors. The Lancaster Protocol was subsequently adopted by hospitals across the country. Jacob Stoltz-Fuss died in prison in 1991 at 71, having never demonstrated genuine remorse. He refused all contact attempts by Sarah or his children and asked to be buried according to Amish customs. The community, while allowing burial in their cemetery, positioned his grave in the most remote section without headstone or marking. Bishop Eli Yoder, who oversaw the funeral as required, delivered a brief but impactful sermon, "Today we bury not just a man, but a reminder of what happens when we stray from God's true teachings." May his story serve as a warning to future generations, and may the seeds of compassion planted through his family's suffering continue to flourish. Sarah never remarried nor returned to the Amish community. She found her place in what the Amish call the English world, but maintained certain upbringing values, simplicity, hard work, and a faith that evolved into a more personal, less dogmatic spirituality. When Isaiah died in 1995 at 33 from heart complications similar to his younger sisters, Sarah faced grief again with the same silent strength. The funeral, different from a traditional Amish service, included music by Isaiah's own recordings singing hymns he loved, and emotional testimonies from those whose lives he had touched. The Stoltz case remains a reference point in studies on cultural isolation and its potential risks. Sociologists and anthropologists frequently cite this story when discussing the delicate balance between respect for cultural autonomy and the need for universal protection of basic human rights, especially for the most vulnerable. In 1998, marking the 25th anniversary of the case's discovery, the University of Pennsylvania organized a symposium entitled "Beyond the Walls of Silence: Lessons from the Stoltz Case." Sarah, then 52, was the keynote speaker. Her presentation, attended by health professionals, social workers, authorities, and students, received a standing ovation lasting several minutes. "The story of my family is not just about trauma and suffering," Sarah concluded. "It's also a story about the human capacity for renewal, about communities that can recognize flaws and work to correct them, about systems that can evolve to better protect the vulnerable, and mainly about the transformative power of truth, however painful it may be." Rebecca and Daniel, the two surviving children, were present that night. Rebecca, now an established artist exploring themes of resilience and transformation, and Daniel, running a small workshop for adapted toys, both embodied their mother's message: even from the darkest circumstances, beauty and purpose can emerge. Although over 50 years have passed, the Stoltz case continues to reverberate in contemporary discussions about cultural isolation, children's rights, and communities' role in monitoring their most vulnerable members. Pennsylvania Stoltz law was subsequently expanded and adapted by several other states, strengthening child protection networks nationwide. For those studying consanguinity, the Stoltz family offers one of the most complete documented cases of the physical, psychological, and social effects of incestuous unions over multiple pregnancies. The medical records, carefully preserved with protected identities for educational purposes, continue to be used in medicine and genetics programs. If you watched until here, it's because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can get to know you and know who really likes the stories on this channel. Don't forget to subscribe to learn about other equally impactful stories that reveal humanity's darkest secrets. Leave your like to support our work and share this video with someone who needs to know these hidden realities that silently shape our society. The Stoltz Fuss story reminds us that some of the most important battles for justice and human dignity are fought away from the spotlight, in remote communities and seemingly invisible lives. It is a testimony to the power of witness, the courage needed to break cycles of abuse, and the possibility of healing even after unimaginable traumas. As Sarah said in her last public interview shortly before her death in 2015, "My hope is that no one else needs to live what we lived. But for those still trapped in similar situations, I want them to know there is a path out of the darkness. There are people willing to help, and there is life, a full and meaningful life, beyond abuse."